Welcome to AEI and our grand opening celebration in our beautiful new headquarters. My name is Mark Thiessen. The incoming Trump administration is going to face a host of challenges and opportunities when they take office in January, from reforming healthcare to tackling tax reform to fixing infrastructure, fixing our underfunded military, fighting the Islamic State, and possibly a trade war with China. So that's a lot on the agenda. And to help us figure out which of these matters we should tackle and when and how, we've gathered some of my most brilliant AEI colleagues to help us discuss these matters. To discuss trade, we have Derek Scissors. Derek's a resident scholar here at AEI, where he focuses on Chinese and Indian domestic economies and the U.S. economic relations with Asia. He's the author of the China Global Investment Tracker and did a series of papers starting in late 2008, chronicling the end of pro-market Chinese reforms and predicting the economic stagnation that's resulted. And he's also chief economist at the China Beige Book. To discuss healthcare, we've got Jim Capretta. Jim's a resident fellow and holds the Milton Friedman Chair at AEI. That is probably the coolest named chair you could have. And he studies healthcare, entitlement, U.S. budget policy. He directed two major studies in 2015 and 2016, one on reforming U.S. healthcare according to market principle and consumer choice, and a second on reforming major federal entitlement programs. He spent 16 years in public service before joining AEI as Associate Director at the White House Office of Management and Budget from 2001 to 2004. And before that, he was a Senior Health Policy Analyst at the U.S. Senate Budget Committee and the U.S. House Committee on Ways and Means. Discuss tax reform, we have Alex Brill. Alex is a research fellow at AEI, where he studies the impact of tax policy on the U.S. economy, as well as fiscal, economic, political consequences of tax budget, healthcare and retirement security, and trade policy. He also works on healthcare reform, pharmaceutical spending, drug innovation, and unemployment insurance reform. And he, before joining AEI, he served as policy director and chief economist at the House Ways and Means Committee, as well as on the staff of the White House Council of Economic Advisors and the Simpson-Bowles Commission. So great background to discuss those issues. And finally, we have, to discuss defense and national security, my colleague in the Foreign and Defense Policy Department, Mackenzie Eaglin. Mackenzie is a resident fellow at the Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies at AEI, where she works on defense strategy, defense budgets, and military readiness. She's worked on defense issues in Capitol Hill and at the Pentagon in both the Office of the Secretary of Defense and on the Joint Staff. She served in 2014 as a staff member for the National Defense Panel, a bipartisan blue ribbon commission that was established to assess U.S. defense interests and strategic objectives. And she was also a staff member of the 2020 Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, which is established by Congress to assess the Pentagon's major defense strategy, and she has repeatedly been named one of the 100 most influential people in defense by Defense News. So thank you all for being here today. A note to those who are watching online, we will be able to field questions from our online audience today. So if you're watching online, to submit a question, go to sli.do. That's sli.do, and then you enter the code AEI event. It's very easy. You just enter your name, type in your question, submit it, and we'll take some of them during the Q&A session. I've got an iPad here, so they'll pop up magically, and we'll be able to take your questions virtually. So let's start with trade. Derek, so President-elect Trump has, he's going to do major changes in trade policy. He's focused in particular on China and Mexico. You say that China should trump Mexico when it comes to trade changes. Why is that?
Well, if you look at the years after NAFTA was enacted, you don't see this massive job loss that was talked about during the election. For 5 years after NAFTA was enacted, not only did unemployment fall and labor force participation rise, but manufacturing employment rose, manufacturing wages rose. So NAFTA seems to me to be either tied to immigration as a political issue or representative of objections to globalization. You can't get jobs back by changing NAFTA when we didn't lose the jobs on a net basis in the first place. Of course there were jobs lost due to NAFTA, but apparently the manufacturing sector expanded, so more jobs gained. Now in the Chinese case, that's not true. When China joined the WTO, we lost in excess of 2.5 million manufacturing jobs. They're not all due to China. Most things that happen in the U.S. economy are due to the U.S., not to other countries. But we do have a time where Americans feel like manufacturing jobs were lost, and it was tied to China. And more than that, China is a much bigger economy, so it has bigger effects on the U.S. It is a worse intellectual property thief. It more effectively subsidizes state-owned enterprises. We have more substantive current problems with China, as well as the history that informed the election. So really across the board, there's more reason to focus on China if you're going to change U.S. trade policy than Mexico.
So Trump is basically wrong about Mexico, but right about China?
Whoa, that's a sweeping statement. I think he's mostly wrong about NAFTA, and I think he makes some very good points about China, and I think that's what he tapped into during the election. That there are millions of Americans who have been negatively affected, especially by the U.S.-China relationship. They're continuing to be negatively affected. There are also gains. It's not as simple as saying everything's bad or everything's good. And we can, if we choose the right trade policy, improve the American economy, improve results for ordinary Americans by changing our trade policies towards China. Whereas with Mexico, I don't think we can do that.
Okay, so lots of people are worried about a trade war with China. You say we should not be especially concerned about antagonizing China economically, that the U.S. has greater leverage than Beijing. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, you've seen a lot of stuff in the newspaper about newspapers and media outlets about how China would win a trade war with the United States. I mean, this is just fundamentally wrong. I'm not advocating for trade conflict, and certainly the U.S. can pick policies that don't make sense and can start a trade conflict. It can hurt us and our allies, and it's not a wise decision. But ultimately, the leverage in the relationship, and President-elect Trump has this right, comes down to the fact that the Chinese run, in terms of goods and services, about a $300 billion annual trade surplus. I'm not one of those people who thinks if you run a trade surplus, you win, and if you run a trade deficit, you lose. When you go into a store and give them money, you don't lose. You get something for it. But the Chinese need that hard currency. They are now in a situation of balance of payments problems where China's reserves have dropped close to $1 trillion in the last 2.5 years. You take away $300 billion a year in the U.S. relationship, they have a very serious financial problem. We have nothing like that on our side. So if push comes to shove, which hopefully it won't, there's much more for the Chinese to lose than the United States. And that's another part where I think the president-elect has put his finger on something that we've been missing. If we want to change the trade relationship, we can. And we're the more powerful actor in the world and in the bilateral relationship. The question is, and the challenge for the Trump people is, can you do that wisely? It's not just, oh, look, we hurt them worse than they hurt us. That's really not a success. The success is, can we do better for the United States in the trade relationship? The power is in our hands, and the wisdom remains to be seen.
So if we have all this leverage, how should the Trump administration use it? What are the best things that the Trump administration could do when it comes to trade with China, and what are the worst things?
Well, we've had two proposals that have come out. You know, everyone in this room knows how chaotic things are now. We've had two proposals that have come out of people's mouths that I really think would be a bad idea. One is to get rid of the trade deficit. The idea, and the president-elect has said this, that we're losing $500 billion to China. We spend money on goods from China. It's a trade of our money for goods that are produced there. That's not a loss. So getting rid of the trade deficit is not going to return jobs. That's false historically. It doesn't make sense logically. That's a mistake. Across the board tariffs are also a mistake. What you want to do is target actual specific problems, and we have a big one, which is China steals American intellectual property, a lot of it, and it costs several $100 billion roughly in sales every year by legitimate U.S. companies. So if you target Chinese firms that benefit from the theft of intellectual property, you're targeting bad actors and leaving the rest of the relationship alone, which does benefit the United States. Another problem is China blocks access to its market by subsidizing state-owned enterprises. When China gives us cheap imports, there are costs and benefits. When they block our exports, there are only costs. So this is another example of don't think so much about imports. Imports help Americans. That's why we buy them. But when our exports are blocked, that's a pure loss. And so there are elements in both intellectual property and subsidies related to exports where the Chinese do cheat. They hurt Americans. We should be able to take action that improve that situation. That would be much better than trying to overhaul the entire trade relationship. I'll close with one point. If you do destroy U.S.-China trade and investment for the sake of balanced trade or something like that, it's not just the U.S. and China that are involved. We have treaty allies in the Pacific, in Japan, Korea, other countries that we're good friends with that are part of supply chains. You disrupt those supply chains, you hurt them as well. So, there are targeted, strong steps that can change the U.S.-China relationship that would help, or at least could help, overhauling it, trying to get down to a zero deficit, 45% across the board tariffs. It's not going to help the United States. It will hurt China, but it will also hurt our friends and allies.
Now, you say we shouldn't. President-elect Trump has said that on day one they're going to label China a currency manipulator. You say that would be a mistake?
It would be a small mistake. If you focus on currency manipulation, you're not going to bring jobs back. When China's currency has been weak, which is what we say we don't like, the U.S. economy has been strong. When China's currency has been strong, the U.S. economy has been weak. And the connection there is it doesn't really matter. We have no evidence that it actually matters. So, if you label China a currency manipulator, it doesn't require the United States to do anything. Go ahead. It fulfills a campaign promise. It doesn't require the United States to impose large tariffs. And in fact, if you tried to calculate large tariffs, you couldn't do it. So I just think my problem is not with calling them a currency manipulator in the first 100 days. The president-elect has promised to do that. He should keep his promises. My problem is focusing on currency manipulation. Currency manipulation is not the major issue in the relationship. It hasn't been for a long time. You can't go back in time with trade policy. We can't recreate 2001 and 2002. Even if we made mistakes back then that we all recognize, oh, I wish we hadn't done that, it doesn't matter. You can't undo the mistakes that you made 15 years ago. And so that's where I think currency manipulation takes us off on the wrong track. If you thought it was a problem 10 years ago, you very well could have been right. But it's not a problem now, and it's not going to help us now to act like it's still 2005 or 2006.
Now, President-elect Trump has said he's going to pull us out of the TPP. You have read the entire Trans-Pacific Partnership. You read it so we don't have to. But since you've read it, you kind of agree with Trump that it's not the greatest agreement. Can you tell us why, and is it going to hurt us to pull out of TPP, or is it okay?
Well, first of all, I'd like $1 from each of you for reading the agreement on your behalf. Anyway, just leave it at the door. I took a stand against TPP, an unpopular stand, a year ago. This was long before the rise of Trump during the Republican primaries and so on. And I took that stand based by reading the agreement and saying, I want this to be a trade agreement that liberalizes trade, that opens up opportunities for American companies and workers, and it doesn't do that. And if you read it closely, it doesn't do that. I'll just give one example. The U.S. is the most competitive services producer in the world, and we're the most competitive services exporter in the world. And when you look at all the exemptions in the agreement, we're not going to get greater services market access. That was my conclusion in November of last year. 6 months later, the International Trade Commission said the same thing. Now, I don't agree with the president-elect that TPP is the worst agreement ever and it's going to destroy everything. I just don't think it's going to accomplish anything for us, and I want our free trade agreements to actually promote free trade and to create opportunities for American workers and firms. The Secretary of Commerce designate, Wilbur Ross, said, TPP is, I've forgotten exactly the word he used, but something like a myth or a dream in a lot of people's minds. And I think that's fair. People who think that TPP is going to create a lot of economic opportunities in the United States, they're just wrong. And if you look at the text and you try to run numbers, you don't get that. Now, is there a cost to dropping TPP? Yes, there is. I think people who are like me, who are critical of TPP, have to be honest about this. I don't like it as a trade agreement. The cost is on the strategic side, and Mac and others can probably speak to that as well. We have alliance relationships with Japan. We are trying to build a closer relationship with Vietnam. We're going to lose our major initiative in the region without TPP. So I think the president-elect is right to say, I don't want TPP. I think he's right to say we're going to leave it. But what that does is it puts the pressure on him to say, okay, what are we going to do? Right? We need to do something in Asia. We need to engage the region. This is, Asia, depending on how you define it, has more than half the world's population. It is an opportunity for U.S. businesses. It's a flashpoint in security terms. We can't throw out the TPP, even though it's flawed, and replace it with nothing. And so the first thing that I really want to hear from the president-elect's Asia team as they come together is not TPP, TPP, TPP. To me, TPP is a dead issue, and that's fine. It's what you're going to do instead.
All right. So Trump has said that he is a free trader, that he's a deal maker, and that his goal is not to raise protectionist barriers. It's to negotiate fantastic agreements, right? And so, what are the chances that he does something counterintuitive, which is rather than starting his trade policy by tearing down agreements, actually goes out and negotiates some free trade agreements? And who might that be with, and where should he go?
Right, I think that's the right question to ask. And I would love to say that if we do negotiate FTAs, free trade agreements, in 2017, it's all because of me. I have no idea what the chances are. Unfortunately, I don't have that kind of knowledge or influence. That would be, let's take an example, and it's a very thorny one, but if we're trying to move forward in the Asia Pacific without TPP, there are countries that are developed countries. They don't have low labor costs. They're not in the Mexico, China vein where a lot of Americans feel like their low labor costs means that jobs are leaving the U.S. Japan is one. Japan would be a very difficult negotiation. New Zealand is one. New Zealand would be a very easy negotiation, but perhaps symbolically valuable. Look, the U.S. is signing free trade agreements. And then the big one in terms of its political impact would be Taiwan. And it would have to be very carefully considered because it would upset China in various ways. But it would show a commitment to free trade despite political costs. Signing an agreement with New Zealand is easy. A few dairy producers would get upset, and that's pretty much it. If you want to show you're really committed to free trade, I think you can make progress with Taiwan. Making progress with Japan would be difficult. Obviously, there are countries outside of Asia Pacific. If the British could move quicker on Brexit than they are, it would be great to start negotiating with the United Kingdom. They have to get out of the EU before we can do that. I think there are countries in sub-Saharan Africa that would be politically symbolic. There are a lot of options open to the new administration to show that the president-elect means what he says about free trade. And they don't have to be earth-shattering. We don't have to sign a giant multilateral free trade agreement, which the president-elect doesn't like. He wants bilateral agreements. Just show that you're moving forward. Pick the countries that you want to deal with to say, look, I am not a protectionist. I have problems with our relationship with China. I may have problems with immigration with Mexico. I have particular problems, but I am committed to competition, which is what drives our economy. And I'm going to show you I'm committed to competition by moving forward in a positive way with Taiwan, even though it's difficult, or a country in sub-Saharan Africa where the U.S. has no free trade agreements, to show that I care about that area of the world and I care about free trade. There are a lot of options open. What matters is that you do something that shows exactly what you talked about, that positive commitment.
Lots of people are worried about a trade war with China. If we start targeting their IP theft, we start targeting their currency manipulation, we start targeting their subsidies, and oh, by the way, we're going to negotiate a free trade agreement with Taiwan. We're going to have a hot war with China if you follow your prescriptions now.
Yes, it's true that in the menu of choices, you probably don't want to go into the restaurant and order everything. I've been guilty of close to that on occasion, so I'll tell you it's just not a great idea. I used in my paper a Cheesecake Factory-like menu of options, and that was a deliberate use of the term on my part, having overeaten at the Cheesecake Factory many times. You want to pick one, and there are a couple, and that's where the people in the new administration matter. When we have a prominence of people who've been involved in the steel industry, for example, and if they want to focus on Chinese subsidies to large state-owned steel enterprises. We just had today an announcement that China was merging its largest and then one of its largest state-owned steel enterprises because they weren't big enough already. They're already enormous. There's already too much capacity. There are already too many people working. They're already getting subsidies like crazy. Now they're going to merge them. You want to focus on that issue? That's fine. I'm simply saying there are a range of options you can focus on, IP instead of that. If you want to show the Chinese, the president-elect likes leverage, he likes bargaining, you want to get the Chinese attention, you start negotiating with the Taiwanese. Now, yes, there's a risk to that, but the U.S. is planning on changing the U.S.-China trade relationship. That's, it's a big relationship. It has a lot of aspects to it, including Chinese investment in the U.S. Make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. That would be one of them. So, no, I wouldn't pick everything on the menu to do at once. I would pick what the new administration is most comfortable with. It looks like maybe subsidies would be where they start. That is part of the campaign platform. And that would be fine. But if you also wanted to say we want to move forward with free trade, you could put it starting the negotiations with Taiwan in there as well.
All right. Well, let's turn to healthcare, Jim. So we've got now a situation where finally Republicans have unified government. They have the House, the Senate, the White House. They've got a lot of options when it comes to repealing and replacing Obamacare. You've written that on Obamacare, the GOP is about to choose a path that will haunt them for years to come. What's that path? What should we avoid?
Well, I think the idea on the table these days is to move forward quickly on a repeal-only measure, which would be to roll back the Affordable Care Act in a couple of key ways, mainly the subsidies that are available in the exchanges and the Medicaid expansion, as well as the taxes that are imposed to require people to buy insurance, so-called individual mandate, the employer mandate, a couple of other key taxes. they're thinking about moving very quickly in the Congress with a reconciliation bill, which is a bill that can't be filibustered in the Senate, to repeal those provisions without replacing them with anything else, putting a 2-year sort of delay on some of the key provisions, and then essentially saying to their colleagues across the aisle, the Democrats, please negotiate with us. We want to replace this now that we've repealed it. And I think there's a couple problems with that. One is that if you move forward with a repeal bill like that, the exchanges are already somewhat unstable financially, that they have attracted a disproportionate number of people that are using a large number of medical services, so the premiums are higher than people anticipated. The insurers are all losing money. If you add to that there's a likely endpoint to the individual mandate in 2019, for instance, the subsidies end in 2019, the Medicaid expansion ends in 2019, the willingness to participate in the ongoing structure for 2 years goes down quite a bit. And so what's there may not even make it to 2019. And at which point the people who passed the repeal bill in some ways own the ensuing mess, which would be pretty substantial. So my recommendation is that they do repeal with replace, that they think through what they want to do in terms of a revamped way of providing health insurance coverage. They try to do it more or less simultaneously, and they try, I know it's difficult in this political environment, but they do need to try to make it to some degree bipartisan. The bill that passed in 2010 is teetering now in part because of how it originated. And if you do the same thing just from a different perspective, 5 years from now we might be looking at full repeal of what they just did. Okay, so to have something in place that's going to last, you need a little bit of broad agreement. This is a pretty big issue, healthcare. Everybody is affected by it. It's a hot issue. It's not something you can treat lightly. And so they ought to move with some care and do it. Now, one other point on this is that my suspicion, with a little bit of knowledge of why someone in the Congress might want to move ahead with just repeal and say, oh, we'll do replace in a couple of years' time, is they can't really agree on replace, and in some degree they don't really want to replace it. At which point you really do have a problem because American healthcare does need reform. It does require some action from a legislative perspective to do it right. And the folks that have been complaining about the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, need to realize that they're now in power. They're going to be governing. They have to put forward some kind of positive vision to make sure people can get health insurance in some way that's workable and practical and can be done. And that's not going to be free of any political controversy. There's going to be some political problems associated with that. There will be winners and losers. Some people might lose their seats because they vote for it. That's just the way it is. But to govern is to choose, and you got to move forward. If you've got a vision for how you want to do American health care, I would say, what's holding you back? This is your moment. This is the time to do it right now. If you delay for 2 years on trying to come up with replace, the odds are you won't come up with anything credible or workable. You'll get to October of 2018. The Senate Democrats will say, why don't we just reinstate what you've already repealed, because otherwise we're going to have total chaos and millions of people will lose their health insurance, and you'll be under the gun to essentially reimpose what you repealed 2 years earlier. So I don't like, maybe you got that idea, I don't like repeal only.
Okay, so Speaker Ryan and other folks on Capitol Hill seem to believe the opposite. They believe you have to play chicken with the Democrats, and that unless we repeal, Democrats will have no incentive to negotiate a replacement plan. They say that they can get the Democratic votes by targeting, there's 10 vulnerable Senate Democrats who are up in 2020, who are in states that Donald Trump won, and that you target those 10 to get your 60 votes to pass something. But you have to pull the Band-Aid off first and repeal it, or else they'll never come to the table. They have no incentive to do that.
Right. Well, I think the predicate there is that the Republicans have some secret plan that they will work with them in behind closed doors, that if they can just get them to the table, they'll get these Senate Democrats to agree to the secret plan that somehow they don't want to reveal in public. Okay? And I think Senate Democrats are, maybe a little slow on the uptake on some things, but I doubt they're going to be that slow, okay? They're going to say, well, show us your plan, and then we'll talk about it, okay? You've had 2 years, by this time, maybe it's, early 2018, excuse me. Tell us what you have in mind. Let's see what the CBO cost estimate is. I mean, they're going to have to come forward, the Republicans, with some idea of what they're going to do, have it estimated, a legislative plan, and then, maybe they then can bring some of the Democrats to the table to discuss it. But I think the idea that they're just going to not do anything, never propose anything, get the Democrats in the room and come out with a plan that all the Republicans will then be happy with, I think that's the odds of that working out well is very low.
So Republicans don't, your assessment is that there's not agreement among Republicans as to what to replace it with.
That's correct.
But there's been some good work done, hasn't
there? There has been.
Dr. Tom Price, who's now going to be head of HHS, he's proposed an alternative. There's a lot of ideas out there, it's just there's not consensus around it, is that right? Yeah,
I would say that, was put forward here at an AEI event not too many weeks ago that Speaker Ryan came to and some key committee leaders in the House came to, where they unveiled what they called the Better Way healthcare plan. And it's a good plan. I mean, it's not a fully developed plan yet. It's a white paper, but it's got the elements there that are clear and pretty straightforward about how you got to move forward. If they could all rally around that, flesh it out, put it into legislative form, get a cost estimate, kind of get it ready to go, that's the way to go with this. What I fear, and I think is going on, is that there isn't unanimity, amongst Republicans about that plan, right? Because it does have in it something that's central to making any of this work, which is a refundable tax credit. Basically the issue here, one of the main problems we have is that if you're a low to moderate income household and you're not getting employer-based health care, it is very difficult to afford premiums. There's a very large tax break, tax preference associated with employer-paid health care that doesn't, in general, confer to individually purchased insurance. The Affordable Care Act provided very large subsidies for people buying insurance now on their own through the exchanges. If the Republicans decide that's not the way to go, and I agree with that, there's a lot of problems with the way they've structured things, they do have to provide some financial assistance that's comparable to the tax break that people get from employer-paid health care if you're not getting an employer plan. Something on the order of, for a family, maybe a $5,000 tax credit or $2,500 if you're an individual. Now, for a lot of Republicans, that feels like the right way to go, but there are some who say, hey, that looks like spending to me, not really, it looks like a new entitlement just with a different label on it. And they have to get over that. I mean, there's going to be no possible way to make sure someone is making $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 a year who doesn't have access to an employer plan can get health insurance without any kind of financial assistance from the federal government. It's just not possible. It won't happen. It won't work. And unless they want to just say, well, you're out of luck, you're not going to have health insurance, they got to agree that they have to do a tax credit.
So everyone's focused on the tensions between Republicans and Democrats over a replacement plan. But during the campaign, Donald Trump has publicly praised single payer. And during the campaign, he said, and this is a quote, "This is a un-Republican thing for me to say, but I'm going to take care of everybody and the government's going to pay for it." Is there going to be friction between Trump and the congressional Republicans when it comes to what the replacement is? Is he going to do something, is he going to sit down with Chuck Schumer and come up with something that we would have never dreamed of?
Well, look, I mean, that's the looming question over policy making in Washington in general. I don't think that's just confined to the health space, which is that the president-elect has said many, many things on many, many fronts that, how it squares with reality on the ground, with actual policy making, with kind of working with his Republican now comrades. How all that gets played out, I really have no idea. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that the statements he made about healthcare were off the cuff, and he shoots from the hip a lot, and so he did on healthcare, and those are probably his basic instincts, right? And do his basic instincts then translate into upending everything and turning things upside down? I can't really tell. I kind of doubt it, because I don't think they're quite formed enough to really lead in any particularly constructive direction.
But if Republicans are not united behind a alternative,
yeah.
So the Democrats are united. They have their plan. They've acknowledged that there are things that are not working, and so they're all on record pretty much as saying it needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
Though at that, Republicans are divided. Trump recently said, after maybe it was shooting off the cuff, but as president-elect, he said, maybe we'll amend it instead of repealing it. That sounds like music to the ears of Chuck Schumer. Is amending versus repealing an alternative that we should consider? And do you think there's a chance they'll go down that path?
Well, it's certainly possible if the Republicans who are controlling Congress and in the administration get bogged down to some degree and can't kind of find their own clear path forward, then they may end up, in the end of the day, compromising and kind of saying it's repeal and replace, but people might look at it and say it looks an awful lot like what we used to have, right? So there's a possibility of that. I think what the president-elect was talking about with respect to amending rather than repealing was specifically, I'm pretty sure about this, that I think he's right about the fact that whatever is done is going to have some level of fairness around the issue of pre-existing conditions and people with expensive medical problems that need to be able to go into and out of different insurance arrangements without their health status being a huge penalty against them. Okay? Now it's a long, complicated story about where it was prior to enactment of the Affordable Care Act, but it wasn't perfect. And there were a lot of people, when they went into the individual market, could end up with huge premiums, even though they had been insured their whole life, just because they had a previous episode of cancer, for instance. And a lot of people thought that was unfair, and I think rightly so. And so the Affordable Care Act barred the use of health status in any way being used in setting premiums or coverage or being denied the ability to buy insurance plans. And so I think the candidate, Trump, just looked at that and said, well, we got to do something similar to that. I don't want to get rid of that basic thought process. The question is, how do you do that if you don't also have the individual mandate and trying to make people buy insurance? I think it can be done, but it takes a carefully crafted proposal with a strong incentive for people to be in insurance. If you say that people can move freely without any penalty about their health status, that only works if people stay continuously insured. And so you can do a continuous coverage protection idea. That is, if anyone stays in insurance and they need to move from one platform to the other, for instance, from an employer to the individual market, they shouldn't have a penalty based on whatever their health condition might be. But if someone voluntarily opts out of the insurance market and then says, I just want to pay premiums, and then they try to get back in later, then you do have to have some kind of way of assessing that so that people don't game the system, so to speak. One further point on this is that you only can do this kind of issue, this question treating with pre-existing conditions in this kind of way, you can only do it rationally if it's reasonable that anyone can get health insurance in the United States. And this is really probably the most important point about the plan that Paul Ryan and his colleagues released last June. It was a Republican plan that said everybody in the United States should be able to get an affordable, at least catastrophic health insurance plan. If you're not in an employer plan, you get a tax credit. And the tax credit will put within reach of you and everyone else an affordable insurance plan. Or you'll be in Medicare and Medicaid. So there's really no reason for anyone in the United States not to be continuously insured. And I think that's the beginning point for actually offering a credible alternative to the ACA.
So if we want to get Democrats on board and we want to do this in a bipartisan way, because I think you're right that one of the flaws of the ACA, and quite frankly all of Obama's agenda that's getting repealed, is that it was done by either by executive fiat or by pushing through on partisan lines, and that real successful reform that lasts has to be bipartisan. There has to be then some things that continue from Obamacare.
Yeah.
Even if you repeal and replace it, there are going to be elements of Obamacare that stay. You've mentioned pre-existing conditions, and I know it's heresy in some circles, but what are the good parts of Obamacare?
Well, one of the great ironies of Obamacare is, the launch of the exchanges in late 2013 for the 2014 enrollment year, was obviously a national news, and everybody remembers how the website crashed and everything. But the design of a online portal for selecting insurance and having it fairly transparent and clear, and then having a subsidy attached to it that can go to the person's selection, was actually a pretty big innovation, frankly. Imagine a federal government program that built no new bureaucracy, and through an online portal system is essentially, entitling people to a benefit and then making it available to them, paid to the insurance plan, pretty seamlessly. So, and they spent a lot of taxpayer money to build this structure. I would not just throw it overboard, okay? I mean, the structure is basically there. Let's make it, better and improve it, and not make it, a monopoly. Let's allow the private sector to participate more fulsomely. Let's the choices expand. But that our infrastructure is useful, and it can be good for a GOP type plan as well as the ACA.
Excellent. All right. Let's turn to tax reform. Alex, people who care about tax reform are kind of hoping for a stalemate here on Obamacare because there's only so much oxygen in the political environment to do major comprehensive reforms. And Republican Party, though Obamacare has been a big driving political force for in the GOP victory, Republicans are generally known as the party of pro-growth tax reform. So what are the prospects for pro-growth tax reform, and can we juggle and chew gum at the same time? Can we reform healthcare and also do pro-growth tax reform as well?
That's a great question, and I think something that's oftentimes overlooked because folks who are so healthcare focused are just healthcare focused, and folks who are so tax focused are just so tax focused. And across the whole spectrum of policy issues, people in their own individual buckets are seeing the potential for opportunity. But a lot of these issues end up running through the same congressional committee in the House or in the Senate. All the issues that we've talked about so far this morning, to the extent that they run through Congress, they run through the House Ways and Means Committee. And there's only so much bandwidth. I definitely agree. I do believe that the healthcare reform agenda is important and potentially runs conflict with the tax reform agenda, just because there are only so many days in the year. The president will have a lot of momentum starting in January. People are very excited, but they're going to the priorities will need to be set. And so if the plan is the one that Jim outlined and rightly criticized, the repeal agenda, maybe that could fit. I agree with Jim, it's not the right way to go, but maybe that pathway could also accommodate tax reform, because the repeal bill is a simple effort, procedurally simple effort, and that would sort of free up the spring and early summer for tax reform. I think that if Congress chose to pursue the wiser path that Jim outlined, I think that if that was the agenda for 2017, then that would potentially knock tax reform back a year. And it has a little bit to do with the burdens on the committees, has a little bit to do with the budget. Right? There's only so much we can run deficits, but at some point people are going to say enough is enough from a budget perspective, and a lot of these things might cause at least a near-term budget hole, and there's only so much capacity that the members themselves are going to have to move agendas. And we saw that before. We saw that in the beginning of the Obama administration. He didn't get everything he wanted. Sometimes to us it feels like he did. We saw that in the Bush administration. They got a lot done, but they didn't get everything done. And so they'll have to weigh those priorities.
So Jim points out that there's not a lot of Republican consensus on what replace is. Is there Republican consensus on what tax reform looks like? And in a simple way for those of us who don't crunch the numbers every day, what are the outlines of that reform if there is consensus?
There's far more work that's been done and far more consensus on the tax front, I think, than the healthcare front. The deal's not done for sure. We don't really know exactly what the administration is going to be proposing or advocating. We don't know what priority they're going to put on it, but we also don't know what details they're going to put in their own plan. But just as you said, the Republicans are a party that are expert in tax policy. They're far more expert in tax policy than they are in some of these other items that we're discussing. They have a lot more experience legislating in this area in the last 10 or 15 years. They have a lot of experience in pointing out the flaws of the Affordable Care Act, but they have less experience in legislating on the healthcare front, Part D aside, I guess. But in tax policy, a lot of legislation has been enacted. In the last few years, less has been actually enacted, of course, but a lot of work has been done. And I would point to two efforts in particular. Former chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Dave Camp, literally wrote it down and scored it. Something that Jim was describing, the difference between a white paper and an actual legislation is oftentimes day and night. And Chairman Camp actually showed that a revenue-neutral comprehensive tax reform bill can be drafted and scored and analyzed. And he did that with great effort on his part and the other parts of the other members of the Ways and Means Committee and certainly on the staff. Put that plan out there, broadened the tax base, lowered tax rates, a tax reform on the corporate side, phased down the corporate tax rate, moved to a territorial system, put some options in that plan because a lot of this stuff is really complicated, needed the feedback from the business community about what will actually work and won't work and who the winners and losers will be, and allowed those plans to be properly vetted. Chairman Camp, I think, wanted that tax reform bill more than anything else and worked really hard to drive that process. But I've said for 8 years now, we can't have tax reform without strong presidential leadership. And we haven't had that in the recent past. And so that effort as a legislative matter has not gone forward. Just as leaders in the House put forward a Better Way health reform white paper, this summer they did the same on tax reform. Chairman Brady and Speaker Ryan outlined a Better Way plan for tax reform. I spent the last few months trying to analyze that plan here at AEI. We've got a model of our own that allows us to score and analyze that plan both from a budget perspective, from an economic perspective, and I think I'm a big fan. I'll say that directly. Base broadening, lower statutory rates for individuals, a simpler plan. 95% of people would claim the standard deduction creates a lot of fairness and simplicity. Corporate rate comes down. And I think it's something that has a modest budget cost in the first decade, probably no negative budget impact in the long run, and something that is pro-growth. And so that's the starting point.
Is there Democratic interest in those ideas?
I don't think so. I'll be honest. I mean, they haven't expressed any interest. But there's a question about how necessary is that? And so in the House, less necessary. It's just the way the rules of the House work. The question is will there be Democrats in the Senate who are willing to play ball on tax policy? And what I would say, and again, to contrast this with health care, is there's been evidence in the last few years that there are Democrats, particularly Democrats in the Senate, interested in tax reform and in particular interested in corporate tax reform. And so why wouldn't they be interested in a middle-class tax cut? And they've expressed interest in quote-unquote fixing our corporate tax reform. Now, the devil's going to be in the details. What they think is a fix may not be what the business community agrees is a fix or what Republicans think is a fix. But I think there is historically more evidence of bipartisan cooperation in the Senate on tax policy, and there will be a willingness of the Schumers of the world to engage.
To Jim's point, though, that one of the reasons why Obamacare is about to be repealed, whether it's going to be replaced is an open question, but it will be repealed, is because it was done on partisan lines, right? And we can do that in the House, as you point out. But if you pass tax reform in the Senate without a lot of Democratic buy-in, then it just, the tax cuts will get repealed and changed than when the political wins. I mean, George Bush's tax cuts were more lasting, though there was unfortunately one of the concessions of the Democrats was that there was a stop to the time. But he got a quarter of the Senate Democrats to vote for it. Is that even a possibility in today's political climate to craft something that we would like and would also get a quarter of the Senate Democrats or even enough Senate Democrats to pass it?
So it's an interesting question because, at the end, so you're absolutely right, of course. The Bush tax cuts were imposed on a temporary basis due to the reconciliation process, the rules of reconciliation. Today, almost all of the Bush tax cuts are permanent law, so we overcame that hurdle eventually, but not the top rate, right? Mm-hmm. Everything but the thing that people and not the rate on capital gains and dividends. So some of the real drivers of encouraging savings and investment and entrepreneurship are the provisions that never had bipartisan support, and ultimately we lost in a budget deal a few years ago. The more buy-in there is, the more permanency there's going to be. But it's not a rock-solid relationship. Medicare Part D was not a bipartisan effort. It's not going away. So, there were Democrats obviously in the room, and there was negotiations with Democrats, but that's not something that I would point to as an example of overwhelming bipartisan cooperation, unlike, say, the bill that's moving today in the Senate, the 21st Century Cures bill, which is clearly a bipartisan effort. And so things can be done on a partisan basis and stick. Bipartisanship is nice. Sometimes, on the other hand, some of the worst things we ever do, we do on a bipartisan basis, right? Like really bad ideas when corporate interests and union interests come together and come to Congress. We can get bipartisanship on some really bad ideas sometimes. So it's dicey.
So we were talking about trade at the start of this conversation, and there's a more isolationist tint to U.S. trade policy. President Trump won a lot of states that Barack Obama won twice in the center of the country, largely because he appealed to white working class people who were upset about our jobs going to Mexico and China, and he said, I'm going to bring those jobs back. We know he's not going to do that with tariffs or with trade policy. Is tax reform a way to deliver for those folks? Are there ways that we can reform the tax code that will bring jobs to this country that protectionist trade policies won't? And is that really critical to his ability to keep those, the Obama Democrats who came over and became Trump Democrats?
So there's sort of two components to tax reform that have the potential to appeal to those voters. One would be a direct change in the tax code, something directly affecting their tax bill at the end of the year, a middle-class tax cut of some sort, something where you can clearly illustrate, if you earn $40,000 a year, you were going to pay this, and now you're going to pay that. That sort of direct politics. That's often a big component in tax reform debates. It was a big part of the 2001 tax cut. What does this mean for me directly? That might be costly from a budget perspective to push a big middle-class tax cut. It's certainly something that Donald Trump campaigned on. The other way, I would say, is an indirect effect, something that encourages more economic growth in those communities. And one big difference between what Ryan and Brady proposed this summer and what was proposed by the Ways and Means Committee in previous Congresses relates really to this issue. There's much more focus on the business side of the Ryan Brady plan on promoting domestic investment than there has been in the past. And I won't go too deep into the weeds here, but basically what we're talking about is not only a dramatic cut in the corporate tax rate, but a reduced rate on pass-through business income, and in particular this provision, this expensing provision, the ability to immediately write off investment rather than depreciate it over time, is a policy that's going to dramatically reduce the cost of capital for domestic investment and should drive a lot of investment here in the United States. And to me, that's a policy that's going to help with our manufacturing base and help with our jobs.
Last question. So the president-elect and the vice president-elect are going to Indiana today to celebrate their big victory in getting Carrier to keep about 1,000 jobs in the United States that they were going to send off to Mexico. We don't know the contours of the deal yet, but there seem to be, I guess, there's state tax incentives, but we don't know what the sticks and carrots were. But doesn't this create an incentive for every business in America to come up with a plan to move their jobs to Mexico so they can come to the federal government and ask for special tax incentives and other things to stay in? And are we going to negotiate with every company? And what kind of precedent does this set? And should we be using tax incentives like this to keep these countries?
So in one sense, this isn't a new strategy that's being engaged in or deployed. Companies negotiate with states regularly for these tax cuts. No tax for 5 years if you move your headquarters here, special preferences like that. That's commonplace. That's certainly second best policy objectives. Good policy would be a clear set of rules that apply to everybody, that make everyone want to be in a given market, not one by one, not taxpayer by taxpayer. We shouldn't set our tax policies one payer at a time, and that's true for the individuals. Of course, it's true for the businesses as well. The unique part here is that it's sort of bubbled up to the federal level, and the president-elect gotten involved in making this deal so great. But I do think that there's a risk that could get worse, but I just note that it's not a new phenomenon either.
Got it. All right. Well, let's turn to national security. So, Mackenzie, we've been talking here about all these great domestic policies that we're going to do. President Trump said he's going to pass massive infrastructure spending, which we really didn't get into all that much. Big tax reform and tax cuts, healthcare reform that covers everyone paid for by the government. No changes to entitlement spending, and also big defense increases spending. Assuming we don't have a fiscal crisis from all of this, is there going to be anything left for defense?
I think that's the question, because I was going to bring up the infrastructure bill, which he or his team roughly pegged at almost $1 trillion. And infrastructure, as was described to me by the majority leader a couple of years ago, is the crack cocaine of Congress. So that's going to move, right? Because that's what everybody wants. It's wildly more popular than the other topics we've been discussing, and it's just good politics.
Yeah.
So you can pair your infrastructure as a carrot with some of these other harder to do things, but I don't, in my world, I would pair it with the military buildup he's proposed, which is significant in cost. Using conservative estimates, we put it at 55 to 60 billion per year in new money required to build up, as Mr. Trump has outlined, militarily, to restore conventional military deterrence. But the thing that you see when you investigate, dig a little deeper, I don't think he's thought it through very much. In fact, I confirmed that yesterday when I spoke to somebody on his Pentagon landing team. But what we do know is on his website, he says he's going to pay for it through reforms and audits and efficiency and better governance, et cetera, at the Pentagon. And I can tell you, also having looked at those numbers, that's just pure fantasy. There isn't even $1 you can get that can be taken from a reform within defense, of which there are many, to reinvest over here in modernization. And the money doesn't move like that anyway. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates already tried that in 2011. He tried to reform so he could reinvest in modernization. It's not as if the money comes out, you get to hold it and give it to Treasury or put it over here or put it over there. It just doesn't work that way, right? And so the buildup is getting more elusive the longer I listen to the litany of priorities of this president. I think it's a lower priority for him anyway. However, if he were smart, politically, I think he would understand something that Alex just brought up, which is our manufacturing industrial base in America. It's primarily auto manufacturing and aerospace and defense, which includes shipbuilding. That's what we pretty much build on a major scale anymore at all in America. Now, there are smaller industries, absolutely, but those are the primary manufacturing bases. And aerospace and defense is bigger. And if you want to show results, and you want to show results quickly, airplanes can be built in 3 years. Ships take a lot longer. So if I'm Mr. Trump, I'm thinking defense is never a jobs program. Any good conservative would agree with that. But if you want this buildup, and we need it legitimately, our fighting forces need it, then you're going to focus. Then this is smart politics and smart defense policy. So it gives you this. It props up a sagging industrial base that's falling behind in designing and welding and machining and engineering, because we haven't been developing that next generation technology and platforms for almost a generation now.
So can you explain to everybody the depth of the hole that we're in right now after 8 years of defense cuts? I mean, how bad is it?
Well, the hole is deep, and it's $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. I feel like we're going to modify the old saying. Pretty soon we're talking about real money, but it's about $1 trillion hole. And you can even pin some of that blame on the last administration. The cost of Iraq and Afghanistan were and still are significant, and the buildup that the military was the spigot of spending, so to speak, that was turned on. It was a hollow buildup in terms of buying conventional forces. It bought perishable items to win the wars we were in, understandably so. But you have to have a military that juggles and chews gum, as you said earlier, at the same time. You've got to win the wars you're in, and you have to be able at the same time to prevent the next one, to prepare for the next challenge. You cannot. They don't have that luxury in the U.S. military of picking one challenge to deal with over another. But that is exactly what happened, financially speaking. And so the hole is deep, and it was exacerbated strongly by President Obama, but with the full support of Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, appointed by a Republican. So Congress was right there to go along with it. I mean, it just kind of goes to show that, as opposed to in a first principles way, going back to the Constitution and going to the preamble, to the life, liberty, and happiness and the pursuit of that therein that are considered so important. Well, life comes first. There is no entitlement without life. Life is safety, right? So it's the primary cause of government, but in this town, defense is increasingly seen as sort of another mouth to feed at the federal trough, which is unfortunate. We've talked about the need to prioritize earlier, but that's not the case anymore. And so what has happened with these budget deals, going back to the failure of the super committee, the lack of enactment of some symbols, and Budget Control Act taking effect and sequestration later, that only dug the hole deeper faster and demonstrated what I just said, which is that there aren't any sort of special politics or consideration for military spending as opposed to other kinds. And in fact, defense is now, when defense became the hostage in these political negotiations, Washington was all too happy to shoot it in the head. So, and tie any further, and once we hit sort of the bottom, the nadir of defense spending, then Washington was all too happy to tie it to any growth in defense now is tied to growth in non-defense discretionary spending, so all other federal spending.
So put it in practical terms. I mean, so what this, we're in $1 trillion hole. What does that mean? I mean, the standard has always been, there have been different variations of it with every quadrennial defense review, but basically we have to be able to fight two major contingencies around the world. We have to be able to fight the conflict now and not encourage somebody else to challenge us because we're tied down somewhere else. In some variation, we had major contingency hold, and but basically we need to have two. Can we do that now? Do we have that capability today? And how hard is it to get it back if we don't?
Right. So what makes our military special and helps define us as a superpower? Well, the size of our economy, I would argue, innovation that originates here in America, our military superiority, and which is defined by this ability to fight and or win 2 wars at one time. That's a superpower status, and it's expensive, and we do not have it. We are a one-war power. And why would a superpower need that? Because our national interests have to be defended at all corners of the globe. And it's entirely reasonable that you would be fighting on 2 fronts at one time. Or open up, as you said, vulnerabilities and to encourage bad actors to move in if you are tied down in one place. We are undoubtedly a one-war power now, one war plus some change, if you will. And that's pretty scary because that's pretty much like everybody else. But the difference is they get to fight in their own neighborhood against us if that's what happens. We have to project power and get there and be there and stay there and sustain our forces there, wherever there is. And if you look at the landlocked country of Afghanistan, that's really hard and expensive to do for decades, or a decade, or however long you want to do it. And so that puts us behind, actually. We're behind those we could potentially go up against, and it encourages them to challenge us, sort of push the rules-based order and what's acceptable in those rules. And we are already seeing that with Russia. We're already seeing it with China building islands of sand. We're seeing it with Russia gobble up sovereign territory of other countries and shooting civilian airliners out of the sky with no consequence, and Iran as well. So they're pushing the boundaries of what we previously might have been thought acceptable because they know that militarily we're weaker, strategically speaking, and that they can take advantage of that because we're probably not going to take action other ways. So
Donald Trump has said that he's going to pursue, you can say, non-interventionist, more isolationist approach to foreign policy. We're not going to. He said we spent trillions of dollars on wars in the Middle East, and we need to focus on nation building here at home, which is actually what Barack Obama also said. They're almost the same words. But if we're not going to be going around, fighting all these wars, why do we need $1 trillion for defense? I mean, can we,
Sure.
fix it up, patch it up, and move on to building bridges and roads? Give them the people the crack they want, right?
Right. You could do that. The problem is you're probably inviting more problems, but it certainly is an option. Based on the words Mr. Trump has used on the trail, his military could look a lot like Mr. Obama's. That's to your exact point. Based on the threats he perceives and in the threat order, which is primarily counterterrorism focused. But the thing about conventional military deterrence, I mean, we call it Reagan's vision of peace through strength, but it was really George Washington who said the surest way to keep the peace basically is to be prepared for war at all times. And so what you do is you build up this giant, strong military for the purposes of not using it, of reassuring your allies, of deterring, getting inside the head of the Putins of the world to not take that next action that could escalate into something that neither side wants to really get involved in. And if you look at history, it worked. So the president who used the military least in the last two generations was President Reagan, and he is the last one who oversaw a conventional U.S. military buildup. In fact, we're still living off the fruits of that buildup today.
So it's not just a matter of throwing more money at the Pentagon, it's how you spend it and what you spend it on. You had mentioned that, if he wants a quick turnaround, planes are great, ships take longer and all the rest of it, but it really should be driven by threats. So what are the threats that we face, and how should we, and if we do get more money for defense, how should we invest it in a way that looks at over-the-horizon threats, not just war on terror and not just Russia,
right.
but what are the over-the-horizon threats, and how should we be spending money now to prepare for them?
So this group of Joint Chiefs has helped organize the current defense budget based on 5 threats in this order: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism. And terrorism beyond just Islamic State, everything from Al-Shabaab to Boko Haram to Al-Qaeda. I mean, it's truly a global metastasization. I think that's about right, and I think that's about right in that order. I think Donald Trump would flip that completely with China at the bottom and not even a challenge to be dealt with. Not necessarily a threat, but a challenge, a competition, as the military would describe it. And somewhat dismissive, actually, of probably the China-Russia competition as it currently stands. I would agree more with the thinking, as I just said now. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said, for example, but some of the over-the-horizon ones said, we're within an inch of war with North Korea every day. That's still accurate, and their missile program is getting better, and their nuclear program is constantly getting better. When they sank the South Korean warship, we are lucky it didn't start the next big war. At some point, whether it's famine or fighting, the regime in North Korea will fall. And the military knows that. So they constantly have to be ready and think about that. And we need to think about some over-the-horizon challenges include Europe, right? So in U.S. military planning forever now, Europe's been a net provider of security, and that is no longer the case. So that's going to consume significant time and attention, and this president-elect has also questioned the value of our strongest and best alliance in the world, which is basically a European one known as NATO. That region of the world is increasingly going to consume more of our attention and time and policy and planning and resourcing in a defense world.
So we did a symposium before the presidential debate, which you participated in, but some folks here might not have read it. But the question was, if you look at the Bush 41's presidential debates, no one asked him about the threat of a war with Iraq, a Persian Gulf War. No one mentioned that, and yet within a few months, we were at war in the Persian Gulf. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. We had to repel that. In the 2000 debates, no one asked either of the candidates about Al-Qaeda. And soon we had 9/11, and we were in the middle of a war that we had never anticipated before. Seems that a lot of presidencies end up being focused on threats and challenges in foreign policy that no one talked about before the administration came to power. So we're a couple weeks away from the new administration coming to power. What are some of the things that could emerge that nobody's talking about today that could emerge to threaten us? You had a really interesting answer in the symposium, but
sure. Well, to start off, it's sort of always there, and we know it's there, but then we forget about it. And it's really our cyber and space capabilities that enables everything, including the lights in the room and the water in the restroom and the GPS on your smartphone and your email and computer to work, and ATMs to dispense money, for financial markets to make micro trading and millisecond timing. We are so vulnerable, and it is our assets that prop this up for our commercial economy are primarily military and increasingly aging and at risk. So China has demonstrated an anti-satellite capability a long time ago. They've done things like dazzle our satellites to show that we're here, don't screw around, we have this capability. We've found a lot of bad actors in the grid, in the power grid, in the water supply system here in the U.S., et cetera, demonstrating again that we're here, you don't know it, maybe we could do something bad, maybe we couldn't, as a way to sort of send a message of what they're capable of doing. I would just put that out as sort of the blanket black swan. It seems to be one we talk about, but I don't know that we really take it seriously enough. I mean, part of the challenge is it's a government and it's a private industry problem together, right? And it's unclear about those boundaries and when is it one party's responsibility versus the other. I do worry with the Sony hack in particular that President Obama, maybe Derek will run away on this, but that he took action when it was a private company, that he took action against a nation state when that private company was hacked and lots of embarrassing things were exposed. But when you have a private industry that owns 85% of this critical infrastructure, it's their responsibility to protect it. It's not the federal government's. But I think Americans expect and assume it's the government, including DHS and DOD and the military, to enable all of that protection and sustainment. So that's just a blanket one. What else did I say in the symposium?
The attack on our space satellites,
Yes.
which was fascinating. I mean, I think you point out correctly that people talk about it, but we're not really focused on it. I mean, people talked about terrorism before 9/11, but we weren't really focused on it until the attack happened. So hopefully we won't wait until we have a cyber 9/11 or an infrastructure
Exactly.
9/11 before we take this seriously.
I think back to Panetta, he called it the cyber Pearl Harbor, and it's a real threat. But to the space war, it's not sci-fi, it's not Skynet, it's here now, and we're already in a fierce competition in space and losing, and we're just lucky that nothing is getting, that conflicts aren't escalating where others can demonstrate, particularly Russia and China, what they could do to us in space and how highly vulnerable we are. I just talked about our own commercial economy's vulnerability because of our reliance on these military assets, but really it's the global economy that depends on these military assets, including theirs, but I'm hoping that would prevent the big one in space. But space is the next frontier, so to speak, and it's now.
That's somewhere before.
Yeah, right.
All right, well, let's take some questions from the audience. As a reminder to our online audience, you can submit your questions by going to sli.do and using code AEIEVENT, one word, AEIEVENT. Submit your questions for consideration, and we'll try and take a couple. Why don't we take a question from the audience? This gentleman in the front here. They'll come to you with a microphone.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, a Japan native, U.S. citizen, member of Reagan Foundations. I have two questions. Number one, the THAAD system we have, I'm talking about North Korea, missile defense. Everybody that I talk to, they say they have confidence in this system. Mm-hmm. I have a question for you. Do you feel that that's sufficient enough? We don't have to have another system, a bigger system in the future. Okay. Number two, what if Japan and South Korea go nuclear? Should we or would we support it?
Right. Great questions. In terms of missile defense, it's a remarkable capability, and it's so strange that it's such a bipartisan. It's a partisan capability because it can't, in and of itself, kill anyone, right? But it's a very hyper-partisan issue. But basically, what we've demonstrated with our own missile defense capability is that we can hit a missile with a missile, right? And so and deflect and take it out. And in fact, we've gotten it down to such great technology. It's basically we could hit a bullet on a missile with a missile. I mean, it's really remarkable, the evolution of that, particularly in the Bush administration. So yeah, I'm really confident in it. I'm just not confident we have enough in enough places. The Congress right now is talking about an East Coast missile defense site, right? Because Iran's weapons can increasingly have further range, and they worry about EMP and other types of threats, electromagnetic pulse. But what's next for missile defense? Space-based. missile defense. That's probably where you're going to need to go next if
Star
you really
Wars.
want global coverage. Speaking of the space, the next big one. So yeah, it's a great technology. But however, it's been starved under this administration. So it's going to require a redoubling of investment. You know, the nuclear question, just writ large. This president has made non-proliferation a centerpiece of his presidency and of his legacy. And Mark may want to speak to your question, the second one also. And we've been basically cutting the number of our own nuclear weapons, more so than Russia, and in the hope that others would then follow. And obviously, hope doesn't buy you this cup of coffee. So what we've seen is the number of nation states in the nuclear club, it goes up and up and up and up every single year. And there is now a question, what are the Gulf states going to do, and Japan and South Korea? It would be totally reasonable if I'm their leaders to start looking into a nuclear program. I mean, so we provide, as treaty allies, extended deterrence to these nations, basically saying you have coverage by our nuclear weapons if you need it, so that you guys don't build your own. I think that policy wouldn't change on paper. I think we want to continue to provide that extended deterrence, but our allies would have every right to question the credibility of that deterrence and the capability and the commitment to doing it if it actually happened. Big question for the new administration.
Questions? This lady right here.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. I think when Donald Trump tried to run a campaign, he is saying he wants to win the voters from the Bernie side.
Mm-hmm.
And he wants to present as not only for the worker, but also as outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
But now we can see that all the top pick of the administration are either insiders or Wall Streeters. And so I just wonder, or somebody is just an old administration staff. So I just wonder how can he, one more point is currently there is a potential House and Senate are controlled by Republican. So unless Republicans all wake up to change the system and Donald Trump to promise to keep his word, so how are we going to expect any change at all?
Want to take this politics question, Mark? He's appointing insiders.
Well, it's fascinating because there are a bunch of insiders, but there's also he's appointing some outsiders as well, or at least people who were on the outer fringes of the policy debate up until now. So it's a mix so far. He's only made a few appointments, so we don't know how many of those people will actually be outsiders. But keep in mind that Donald Trump was an insider. I mean, Donald Trump he ran as an outsider, but he talks about how he gave tons of money to politicians and knows how the system works. The single largest person he gave money to was Chuck Schumer. So he's going to have a great relationship with the Senate Democrats because he's one of his top funders. That could grease a lot of wheels going forward. That might actually be an asset for the incoming Trump administration. So I think the expectation that is all going to be outsiders. Plus, if you're coming in as an outsider, someone who hasn't held political office, and you're a businessman coming in with an outsider perspective, government is very different than business. So you do need people who have experience and knowledge of how the system works in order to, if you want to change it, you need mechanics on the inside who know how it works. So I think that's why he picked, for example, Mike Pence as his vice president, because he wanted someone who had good relations with Congress, knows how legislation is made. Donald Trump's never passed a law before, never written a law, never introduced a law. He's been in private business. So I think you'll end up seeing a mix of those kind of questions. Let's take a question from our viewers. this one will probably be for you, Alex. The economic consequences of increasing the minimum wage, i.e. increased unemployment, are clear. How can the public be made aware of the reality versus the perception of it? Donald Trump has actually expressed support for a minimum wage increase. What do you see is going to happen on minimum wage?
Well, as I recall, the support that President-elect Trump expressed was for minimum wage increase on the state level, not on the federal level. And one of the things that's been interesting in the last few years, we've had a big debate about the minimum wage. It's a centerpiece of the Democrats' platform. First it was $10.10, and then it was $15. That effort was tried and failed on the federal level, but has met success in a number of states. So minimum wage laws are changing, and minimum wages are going up. I agree with the questioner. The economic consequences of those decisions, I think, are not positive. There's some people do get a raise, and other people don't get a job. The Congressional Budget Office has done some good work on the specifics of the economics. But I would also say that that better at the state level than at the federal level. And so that's true for a whole host of policies. And I would say, in addition, let that issue be debated in the states and let people make those decisions locally.
And haven't there been some, especially here at AEI, some good alternatives to a minimum wage increase to make work pay for people who are in the bottom of the income scale, like wage subsidies, expanding the EITC to not just to mothers with children, but to actually to broader base of younger workers? Are there ways, alternatives to make, help someone who's just starting out or in the bottom of the economic scale be able to support their families without having to increase the minimum wage and drive jobs out?
For sure. And so one of the most successful programs is the one that you mentioned, the Earned Income Tax Credit, a major program, largest, I think, anti-welfare program on the federal level. It's a tax credit. The more you work, the more credit you get, up to a max. There have been bipartisan proposals, including from President Obama and with support from Speaker Ryan, about expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit. There's been discussions about there's some significant amounts of fraud in that program, as well as a lot of people who are eligible for that program who don't utilize it. So there's been a lot of talk about EITC reform, as well as the positives that it offers. Of course, the hardest but the best thing to do is help people have more skills, right? I mean, so that's easy to say and hard to do. But people will earn more when they're better workers, right? When they have more powerful machines to work on and have more skills to bring to the workforce, and that's a very hard problem to solve.
Here's one for Derek from Angie. She asks about stealing intellectual property. Can you explain a little more what this is, why it's so harmful, and who it harms?
Defense. You should talk about the defense implications.
Oh. You're not Angie. I don't have to answer you.
Maybe she is.
So the U.S. what the U.S. does best in the world is two things: agriculture and innovation. And agriculture is because we have the most good land, but it's still concentrated in some states. What we do everywhere is innovate. And innovation is not just advanced technology. That's certainly part of it. But innovation is when you have a new idea for a brand. Innovation is when you tweak your website and you have a way to get customers what they want faster and they like coming to your website better than other websites. And you put your label on it and say, this is ours, this is our process, this is our idea. It applies to people working in their garage who just take an existing product and they improve it a little bit, and then someone pays them for it because it was their idea. And the problem with stealing intellectual property is it kills entrepreneurship, it kills invention, not just for big technology companies, but for everybody, for ordinary Americans, and in those companies, for everybody that works for them. So you can get numbers like 35 million Americans work for innovative companies, meaning companies that make their living and survive because they're more innovative than their global competitors. And tens of millions of Americans work for these companies. And when someone steals their IP, all of those workers lose. Not 2 million manufacturing workers, 35 million. And what goes on here is there are a lot of bad actors in IP. There are people who steal IP in the United States. There are people all over the world who steal IP, but nobody is as big as China. And when I talk about IP theft being a big issue for the Chinese, I don't mean that they're the worst at IP, but they're the biggest. And that with, if Bolivia steals American IP, we're not talking about 35 million jobs and hundreds of billions of dollars. Whereas with China, we can get numbers like that. And so it hurts not just advanced technology companies, which the Chinese pressure to transfer technology so they can have it and drive them out of business. It hurts everybody. Any idea you have. The great thing about the internet is you have an idea and people like it and it's a good idea, you're an innovator, you can make money off of it. You can put it up on the internet, they'll find you. The bad thing is, so will people who want to steal your idea. And then it'll appear at some other company. And you've done all this work and you've had this great creative process and someone just takes it away from you. So it sends the wrong incentives, which hurts the American economy. It robs sales from legitimate companies, which hurts the American economy. And it affects tens of millions of workers. It's not a little particular instance where we're just trying to help Qualcomm. So that's why I thought it was important. It is important. And the idea here is what you want to do is say, every country, including the United States, has companies that respect IP that say, all right, this is someone else's. We're going to pay for it. If we use it, we're going to acknowledge that it's theirs. And that means the people who want to innovate have the incentive to keep doing so. And China has those companies too, but they also have companies who steal. You also have companies that say, oh, that was a great idea this guy came up with or this company came up with, we're going to take it and we're going to drive them out of business. And we need to target those Chinese companies that steal things because that will help the American economy in a way that probably no other single action against China will.
Here's one for Jim from Tristan. Do governors like the idea of block grant Medicaid program, not in theory but in reality, and can they afford or staff such a responsibility?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because the Affordable Care Act expanded Medicaid in its traditional form, and so you have now Republicans are coming in saying they want to roll that back and block grant it. Well, I think there's going to be a little bit of a collision of that concept with the governors in the states that expanded the Medicaid program that are now look at the prospect of having that rolled back and maybe getting a block grant. So I think there's going to be some friction between governors who like flexibility, would like a fixed amount of money, but also are not that keen on having the populations that they put onto the Medicaid program kicked off of it. So that would be Arkansas, Ohio, Iowa, Michigan, several other Republican-led states who have expanded the Medicaid program and now are in sort of this uncomfortable position. Now, having said that, they could decide that they want to block grant Medicaid at a higher expansion level, that they don't want to roll it back, but just, have more fixed amounts of money going to the states, but at a higher level of presumed eligibility. That's a possibility. I'm not sure exactly, that'd be expensive, frankly, relative to what they've promised, but it's a possibility. Whether or not this is something that the governors would like and can manage, in theory they do like it. I think most of the Republican governors would like it and some of the Democratic governors would like it. They'd say, we could manage the program, there's a lot of waste in it. So I think they'd all say in theory yes, but the trick will be the total amount of dollars and how much they're going to get from the federal government. And there I think the issue of the expansion population will come to the surface.
Questions? All the way in the back over there.
Person wearing the dark suit.
With the tie.
Right.
So you talked about there being like a defense hole, and right now some people have talked about how we're kind of approaching a third offset phase or third offset era where we're looking to areas of new investment like unmanned aerial vehicles, long-range strike capabilities. President-elect Trump has talked about expanding defense spending, but he's talked about it in a lot of more traditional manners with like expanding troop levels, more traditional aircraft carriers. Do you think that's the best approach to doing targeted defense spending, or do you think there's other ways? You talked about cyber and space capabilities that the new administration could be looking at and focusing on?
It would be a waste of money to go to pursue a conventional military buildup without pursuing the next generation, third offset, whatever you want to call it, revolution in military affairs. It's always got a new name, but it's an important endeavor because you have to see around corners. You have to look beyond the front of your face, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and you have to find the leap ahead technology available in the next 20. What is the next drone capability that's been a true game changer, for example, for our military? But now everyone has drones. Now we need counter drone capabilities because they're going to turn around, use our innovative products and use them against us or hack our own. So what's the next drone? Or before that, what's the next stealth? Precision guided munitions, GPS, global positioning system. These are all fruits of previous offset investments. You know, they are high risk, but small bets. The potential for failure is large, which is why you want to place a lot of small bets, something Congress does not like people to do with taxpayer money, but it's so important because it's how you get things like the internet, which came from the Defense Department, and email, which came from the Pentagon and the military. So if you want to get, and GPS, you know, so if you want to get these capabilities, I mean, it was the only reason we have GPS. It was such a risky experiment and considered so controversial at the time. Is that at the time, Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, took a ride in a helicopter. There was a sandstorm, and they were able to land it. It had been on 4 helicopters out of our fleet of thousands, tens of thousands of them, and or probably about 10,000 helicopters in the military at the time. And he said, "Well, how did that happen?" And I'm like, "Oh, we got this experimental thing called GPS." And he was like, "Okay, love it. Let's do that." If he hadn't had that one helicopter and that one technology, we would never have that capability today. So there needs to be an understanding of this incoming team who's poo-pooed third offset, Mr. Trump and his team, that you got to do both, right? You can't just pursue this Top Gun military of the 80s and buy more fourth generation fighter jets. You have to go for the next generation.
The Top Gun was awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome.
Questions? Gentleman right there.
Thank you, Jack Barker. In thinking about tax reform, there seems to be a general consensus that we need to create more opportunity and more spending power for the lower classes or the lower earning population. Yet I never hear anybody talk about reforming the payroll tax, which is the single largest tax that most of these people pay. It's extraordinarily regressive. It's unfair to two-earner households, which most of these people come from. And yet it never even seems to hit the agenda. And it seems like if you were going to do comprehensive tax reform, you could reduce or eliminate that tax and roll it into the broad income tax and increase the progressivity of the system in a way that also creates jobs for lower earners and makes the entire system more fair. But it never seems to even be on the agenda. So I was just curious as to why not, and if there's any possibility of ever getting it on the agenda.
Sure. So obviously, as you know, and others may as well, the payroll tax is directly linked to our entitlement programs that funds our Social Security and a portion of our Medicare program, primarily on Social Security. So you pay the tax. The tax is, just as you described, capped. So higher income earners, very high income earners, don't pay more than high income earners. It's capped at, I don't know, $118,000. Yeah, thank you. And in that sense is regressive. There was an attempt at the beginning of the second Bush administration to look at Social Security reform because that system is not on a sustainable path. Future outlays are projected to exceed intakes, and the trust fund that exists that was built up in the past is not going to exist in perpetuity. That hit a lot of political resistance. Democrats weren't interested in working cooperatively. We've talked a lot about the need for bipartisanship on some issues. That's an issue where there would need to be bipartisan work. I think the Trump administration has, to my knowledge, not expressed any interest in Social Security reform. Republicans, some like the idea. Many Republicans are afraid of the idea. The real threats and challenges in the Social Security system, they're absolutely real, but they don't occur for a few years. And so people aren't eager enough to tackle those challenges. In a comprehensive Social Security reform, there are options that include changes to the payroll tax system. I would not advocate for eliminating the payroll tax and putting that burden into the income tax system because you earn a benefit. So you're paying a tax, and that's a burden on you, but you are also earning back a benefit at the other end. And so the labor market effects of the payroll tax are very different than the labor market effects of an income tax.
All right, let's take one last question. This lady over here.
Hi, thanks very much for this great discussion. My name is Eva Same, and this is a question to Ms. Egelin. You talked about the threats and priorities of the U.S. in concerning security questions, and you very briefly mentioned your relation to the European Union as your greatest allies, and how the relationship is changing. Could you just expand on that a little bit? What you mean and what you foresee?
Sure. So I mentioned, well, I'll have a whole other panel on the EU, just to put it out there and all of its flaws. But yes, EU member states primarily is I think what you're referring to. NATO, right. Yes, we don't want redundant capability in NATO and EU though, right? So nonetheless, so the NATO has become a global alliance that supports our interests, which is remarkable, and for which once Mr. Trump, I think, is educated about, he will certainly see the value of that alliance, meaning that our friends and partners in NATO now follow us to Afghanistan and any other remote place. They're helping us hunt down terrorists in all corners of the globe right now. It's become bigger than a bulwark against the former Soviet Union, and it's modernized and evolved into in a really productive way as a global alliance, which is fantastic. But there are so many challenges in Europe: financial, immigration, security. And the threats are different, and the threat perception by each country is different. So, I referenced Russia's actions in Ukraine, but let's not forget Estonia and Georgia. In previous administrations, they basically turned out the lights in Estonia, and similar cyber attack on the government of Georgia as well when Bush was president. So these, but there are problems bigger than Russia. There are problems within Europe among the states, right? There's increasing division. Energy policy is another area that you see division. So I think we've always sort of dismissed it as I mentioned, a provider of security, and as a region we can count on for stability, a stability we helped build and create after World War II at great expense. But I don't think that's any longer the case, and that's a major shift in security policy and defense planning in particular, and could get very expensive. So it's in our best interest to keep Europe stable, but it's going to require an understanding to start with of the value of NATO, and I hope Trump will agree with that.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Thank you all very much for a terrific panel, and thank you all for coming.